Hello, scholars. Mr. Long signing on. Today we're going to be talking about World War I. Unfortunately, we're not going to be talking a whole lot about the horrifying combat of World War I, but instead be focusing on the United States entry and involvement and some of the cultural and social consequences of the war in regards to the U.S. population as a whole. So the First World War kicked off in 1914. The story of U.S. involvement, at least direct involvement, doesn't really begin until 1917. The U.S. had been involved throughout the war in some regard, especially when it came to loans or material and food supplies to countries like Great Britain and France. So the United States economically was already tied to the Allies before the declaration of war in 1917. The two main causes for the declaration of war was unrestricted submarine warfare. I'm not going to get, I kind of want to get into it. So, all right, let's get into it a little bit. So the British and Germany, they were kind of in kind of like a trade war in a way, where Great Britain was able to feed and arm its troops with supplies coming from outside Great Britain. Germany, knowing that they couldn't stop this trade directly with their above water fleet, turned to their U-boats or their submarines, Unterseeboots. And what they had done was they had effectively created a zone around Great Britain where any merchant shipping coming in and out may be targeted by these submarines and sunk. This was, in effect, a hope by the Germans to cut off Britain from trade with the rest of the world and help starve the country into submission, much like how the British had used their navy, their above-water navy, to cut off Germany from trade with other countries as well. So it was kind of both sides trying to starve out the other with their navies. Now, the Germans had been expanding their submarine warfare to the point where it was becoming unrestricted, in the sense that didn't really matter what flag was flying, didn't really matter if it was a passenger vehicle or a war vessel. There was a strong likelihood that if a ship was spotted by German submarines, it would be targeted and destroyed, hopefully with a warning for civilians to evacuate, but not always the case, especially with the fog of war. So the unrestricted submarine warfare that was impacting United States citizens, hundreds of them were being killed, mostly aboard British and French vessels, but also the loss of economic goods being lost to the submarines was causing a lot of angst within the United States population. The final push, however, is the Zimmerman note, or the Zimmerman telegram. This was a note sent by Germany to Mexico, trying to convince Mexico to join the war on the side of Germany against the United States. And in exchange for their support, Mexico would receive back land they lost during the Mexican-American War if the Central Powers, led by Germany, would be victorious. The note was intercepted by the British, given to the Americans, and the Americans lost their minds over this attempted stab in the back. On 2 April 1917, Wilson is going to go for Congress and ask for Congress to declare war, because, again, the president cannot declare war themselves. This can only be done by an act of Congress, which will then be approved. And in 1917, the United States is at war. It's going to take the United States quite a while to get their military up to speed. The United States before World War I had a painfully small military. I think only in the number of tens of thousands, especially with the Army. The Navy, of course, had their own numbers, but it's going to take them a while to draft soldiers, train them up, and then transport them across the ocean to be ready to fight against the Central Powers. So hence this time lag here. In January 1918, Wilson is going to deliver his 14 points. The 14 points had two main purposes. The first one was to keep Russia in the war by saying, hey, like, we're committed to this cause. We're going to come in, just hang in there a little bit longer, because Russia had been teetering on the edge of backing out. The second aim was to provide a moral foundation for the allies of Britain, France, Belgium, all the other allied countries to wage this effectively a crusade against the Central Powers, and that if the Allies won, these are, this new world order is going to come into being, and it's going to make the world a better place with rainbows and unicorns and giggling children. It's going to be fantastic. Of the 14 points, I'm going to only touch on the first 5. Those are kind of the most optimistic ones. The first 5: abolishment of secret treaties. That's going to be hopefully to help prevent another war like World War I, where all these countries were popping out of the woodwork to declare war on each other. We have freedom of the seas. This was a direct attack at German submarine warfare and the British blockading Germany so that there could be free trade, at least across the ocean. Removal of economic barriers to help everyone be more friendly with each other and help encourage international trade to prevent a further war. A reduction of arms, so de-armament across the nations, and an adjustment of colonial claims. And if you think back to some of the causes of World War I, we have several of these being addressed. So if we're looking at some of the causes, we have militarism, which is being addressed with bullet point 4. And we also have colonialism, which is being addressed with number 5. We have entangling and alliances, which is addressed with point 1. And we have imperialism in some ways, is being touched on by effectively all of these. But so several, if not all, of the causes of World War I are being wrapped up in these 5 points to try to, again, prevent another apocalyptic war. The United States, even as its army is getting revved up to go stomp some faces in Europe, the government starts to get moving in the direction of rallying public opinion. Again, they want to turn this into a crusade. They want to get everybody on board. If you're not with us, you're against us, and you need to persuade people that, yes, the war is the right thing, which is challenging because of Wilson's policy of isolationism, that he wasn't going to get involved, that we were going to be neutral, that, there's no real bad people over in Europe. They're just settling their differences. We're going to mind our own business. But now you need to convince everybody to kind of do a 90-degree turn or a 180-degree turn and be fully committed to the war effort, especially with demonizing the Central Powers, with Germany kind of being the main scapegoat or the main, token baddie. So the Committee on Public Information, they're the ones that are going to be leading this cause. They're utilizing posters, leaflets, movies, songs, effectively an army of tens of thousands of employees across the country to spread the word that, hey, this is what we're fighting for and this is how we're going to accomplish our goals. The propaganda gets pretty overt. This is one of my favorite pieces, Destroy the Mad Brute, with Germany very clearly being represented here. Some of the examples is the Pickelhaube German helmet. I think it even says imperialism across the top, maybe militarism. I can't remember exactly, but one of the isms that caused the war. You have Kaiser Wilhelm's awesome upturned mustache. You have a poor, half-dressed woman kind of feigning in the brute's arms to represent Belgium. If you think back to the beginning of the war with the rape of Belgium, this is an homage to that. You have German culture spelled with a German way, which is just a bloody club, saying that the only culture Germany has to offer is violence. You have a war-torn, burned-out hellscape in the background, with America in the foreground, with a body of water that, it's the Atlantic Ocean, and that's burned down and destroyed Europe in the background. And effectively what they're saying is, if we don't stop this German juggernaut war machine over in Europe, the violence and destruction will reach our shores, and the only way to do that is to enlist. And so the propaganda is fairly effective throughout the war. It gets a lot of people involved in the war effort, either enlisting or working in the factories or rationing, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it also serves a very negative purpose of vilifying Germans and other individuals who hail from, whose ancestors hailed from the Central Powers. And so there is going to be prejudice against Germans and Austrians and Italians for a little while, because of their, their ancestors' relation to the Central Powers. We also have a little bit of a boo-boo from the federal government. We have the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. These two acts together are going to frighteningly infringe upon U.S. citizens' right to free speech. The Sedition Act in particular, it effectively made it illegal to criticize the U.S. government, which, during wartime, you don't want to be criticizing your government. You don't want to be undermining the government. However, if you're not directly hurting the government, your free speech in general should be protected. There is going to be a Supreme Court case, Schenck versus United States, that effectively ruled that the freedom of speech can be withdrawn when such speech poses a clear and present danger. So, and similarly, yelling bomb in an airport or yelling fire in a crowded movie theater, if you speak out against the government during a time of war, the government does have a right to censor you and imprison you for your speech. Economics in World War I, the United States, their greatest contribution to the war as a whole isn't just the soldiers that they contributed to, soldiers and Marines that contributed to Europe, but mainly the armaments and the food that they were able to provide to the Allied powers during the war. The War Industries Board, after war is declared, they are established by the federal government to help regulate and help the private sector and the economy plan for the most efficient use of resources to help win the war effort. You can think about this, all these different companies and corporations, steel, oil, rubber, they're all doing their own thing, trying to make profits. And now all of a sudden, with the declaration of war, profits isn't really the main goal. The main goal needs to be, we need to win this war, and we need one group to kind of take charge of them in a way. And there's some debate about government overreaching their bounds in the private sector versus, we need to give up a little bit of our economic freedom for the greater good of the nation, which we're not going to get into that debate now. But the War Industries Board comes in, and they're the ones that help regulate all these little businesses. The National War Labor Board, they're established to help resolve disputes between workers and labor unions with employers. Because again, the government wants to prevent strikes that would harm the war effort. So all right, let's work with the bosses. Let's kind of help nudge them along to give the workers certain concessions, like an 8-hour workday, 2-day weekends, like whatever it may be, to keep the factories running so that the soldiers have the bullets and the bombs to fight. The Food Administration, led by future President Herbert Hoover, the Food Administration is going to encourage voluntary rationing. They don't really want to force rationing on people. It's typically really bad for morale if you take away people's foods and liberties or what have you. And if you can get people to voluntarily give up things, it's typically better for morale to keep people optimistic about the war. And so the Food Administration is going to develop things like Wheatless Wednesdays, where every Wednesday it is unpatriotic to eat grains. And that will help save a little bit of grain that can then be given to the soldiers on the front lines or to the Allies. You have Meatless Tuesdays and different themes for different days. Other agencies are going to jump on the bandwagon as well and encourage patriotic rationing to save resources for the war effort. So the government's not telling you have to, but if you don't, you're a poor American. So a little bit of peer pressure to help benefit the greater good. We also have some instances of victory gardens that are going to become very popular in World War II. And the idea being that if you can grow your own produce to help supplement your diet on your own land, have a little garden in the front yard or whatever, that will help save food from the big farms that could then go to feeding the soldiers and the civilians of allied nations overseas. Suffrage, women are going to make a decent amount of progress during World War I. Unfortunately, a lot of it, not a lot, some of it's going to be lost after the war voluntarily. And World War II is going to be the big war that really sees women break through certain barriers and that stay broken for the modern era. To free men to join the military, thousands of women are going to take up jobs in the factories and other workplaces so that those men can then go off and fight and die. Support of the war effort furthered women's suffrage in several key states in 1917. So because women were so organized and so dedicated to taking these jobs from men, or relieving these jobs from men temporarily to go support the war effort, states start to see women as more of contributing citizens. So states that hadn't quite given women the right to vote start to shift in that direction. This momentum is going to carry through in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment that is going to give women the right to vote across the nation. So good things for women happening coming from the suffrage movement, hailing all the way back to the Seneca Falls Convention. After World War I, most of the women return home to take care of the 3 C's, the cooking, the cleaning, and the children. Some women will stay in the factories and workplaces, but it's not very common. Most of the women generally accepted that moving into the workplace was a temporary measure, not a permanent advancement socially. So most of them are going to go back to the home and when the men come home. The Yanks are coming. So after 3 years of war, the Allies were nearly exhausted. This is the 1917 timeframe when the U.S. enters the war. They were running out of money. They were running out of manpower, and they were on the brink of having to give up. The U.S., realizing that they have no time to lose in reinforcing the Allies, decide to have a draft. Woodrow Wilson was a little hesitant about the draft. If you think back to the American Civil War with the draft riots, you could see why. But because the need was so great, the government decided to go through and conscript citizens for service. So they drafted millions of Americans and sent them off to be trained. Unfortunately, because of the circumstances of the war, being Russia's exit from the war, which allowed hundreds of thousands of experienced combat troops of the Central Powers to come over to the Western Front against France and Britain, the need was so great that many of these soldiers, these U.S. soldiers and Marines, were thrown into combat with minimal training, other than, point your rifle in that direction and follow your leader's orders. In addition to the men that were drafted, women and African Americans also serve in the military. Women were admitted to the Navy and the United States Marine Corps, so good social advancement there. For African Americans, they were also admitted to all the branches of the military, the Marine Corps, the Army, and the Navy, because the Air Force doesn't exist yet. Although the African Americans were only allowed to serve in segregated units, so all the black soldiers would go in this black unit, and they were almost always led by white officers. So there's still that segregation issue. There's still that Jim Crow flavor from the South bleeding into the U.S. military, where the black units were not as well treated by the U.S. military, and especially by other white soldiers. However, the black soldiers really didn't have the same issues when greeted by French or mostly the French soldiers. The British, there were a few issues, but still probably better than many of the American soldiers who were still pretty grossly racist. Let's see here. Yeah, cool. Moving on. All right, so war continues for that last year from 1917 to 1918. It's very intense fighting, typically with poorly trained and experienced Yankees who are fairly green versus the experienced but weary and tired Germans. The war is finally going to end with a armistice, which is just an official ceasefire. So it's not the peace treaty itself. It's just a ceasefire, an agreement that, hey, this war is done. We just need to negotiate the final score. So the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month was the Armistice Day, which is going to become our Veterans Day later on. The war had claimed over 9 million dead and over 20 million wounded. This coincided with a worldwide pandemic known as the Spanish flu or the Spanish influenza, which killed 30 million people from 1918 to 1919. Fun random fact that you didn't ask for: the Spanish flu is called the Spanish flu because Spain was neutral in World War I, and so their newspapers were the only ones reporting the spread of the flu, whereas the British, the French, the Germans, the Americans, they were all in the war, and fear of spreading word of the pandemic would lower morale and eventually lead to the collapse of the governments. They kept it all censored and hushed and hid it from the people. And so because Spain was neutral, they didn't have the same concerns, and they were able to report freely, and they had more freedom of the press. They get the unfortunate moniker of being the source of the Spanish flu name. Taking a look at these combined deaths from just the war itself and the pandemic, if you look at the total population right before the war-ish, we're looking at roughly 2% of the world's population dying during this time, which is pretty apocalyptic, especially if you think about how, most South American and Central American countries weren't fighting in World War I, and most of Africa wasn't fighting in World War I, and most of Asia wasn't fighting in World War I. And so to still have this high of a percentage, it's pretty horrifying. So moving on to the Treaty of Versailles. So after the armistice, after the 11-11-11, the negotiations start to take place. Woodrow Wilson is leading his own camp, trying to push for his 14 points being incorporated into the treaty. A big reason for Germany's surrender, actually, is they were led to believe that they would receive pretty merciful terms as per the 14 points. But unfortunately, the more bitter British and French, who had been in the war longer and seen more horror, they were more inclined to seek revenge than reconciliation. So one of Woodrow Wilson's big points was the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles is going to effectively create the League of Nations, although the U.S. will not be joining it, as we'll shortly see. Other terms is that Germany had to accept blame for the war. There was a specific clause in the treaty called the War Guilt Clause that Germany had to legally accept responsibility, even though if you look back at the history of the war, you've got like Serbia and Austria-Hungary and Russia all declaring war on each other before Germany even gets involved. So that's really just people being petty at the time and not really realistic or rational. Germany also had to agree to pay war debt or reparations, as seen in this cartoon here, with poor Germany being smothered by this giant debt that they had to incur to pay back the countries that beat them up. They also had to give up European territory. They had to give a chunk of land to France and also some of their eastern territories to create the countries of Poland. And they also lost their overseas territory. Most of the German overseas territories are going to go to Japan, which during this time is starting to establish their Pacific Empire that is going to continue to grow until World War II. Most of these punishments would be cited by later German politicians as justification for World War II, or at least created an atmosphere in the interwar between World War I and World War II Germany among the German citizens to be favorable to a repeat of World War I in the hopes of regaining their honor and their territory and getting rid of this guilt that they have from the war. So Woodrow Wilson is helping to negotiate this treaty. He makes a couple trips back and forth to help deal with Congress. Unfortunately, Woodrow Wilson, his idea of the League of Nations is not as popular in the United States as it is in his own mind. Isolationists oppose entering the League of Nations because joining the League of Nations would obligate the United States to help support other members of the League if they're attacked by enemies, or to help be overly involved in international disputes, which isolationists are like, no, like, we're the United States, we need to stay over here. We need to listen to what George Washington said when he said to avoid entangling alliances, and this League of Nations is very much an entangling alliance. The treaty and the League of Nations was also opposed by German and Italian Americans who felt the treaty was too harsh to their mother countries. You can also look at Austrian Americans who, from Austria-Hungary, weren't overly pleased as well. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the political battle, but what's important for you to know is that the treaty is going to go to Congress twice. The second time it's going to fail. It does get the majority, does get more than 50% of Congress to approve it, or at least the Senate. The Senate are the ones that ratify treaties, but they didn't get the 2/3 necessary for a treaty to become approved by the United States. And so the United States is going to never sign the Treaty of Versailles, and we are not going to join the League of Nations, which is going to cause a couple issues moving forward, especially with the outbreak of World War II. So a couple check on learning questions. You should be able to find these throughout the video, or think back to the textbook, or if you need to do some further research, nerd out, loving it. First question, how did the relationship between the federal government and the U.S. economy evolve during World War I? For this one, we're looking at change in that relationship. Question 2, how did World War I impact the role of women in American society, both in the short term and long term? So think, just during the war, how did it change? And then how did the role of women in American society permanently change as a result of change incurred during World War I? Question number 3, why did Congress choose to reject the Treaty of Versailles in 1920? So what was the main argument used to reject the treaty? So that should be it for today. Quick overview of World War I and how it's going to work with the United States. We will talk about these issues in greater detail in class. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can hit me up on Canvas or email or in the classroom, and we'll try to get you guys squared away for the AP exam. Other than that, nope, I'm done. All right, I'm out of here. Mr. Long, over and out.